There are people who have learned to turn off their minds completely, not quiet them, not calm them, actually switch them off, leaving a gap in time where consciousness simply stops existing. If you're listening to this at night, perhaps unable to sleep, thoughts cycling endlessly, this might sound impossible. Your mind has probably never stopped once since you were born. Even in your deepest sleep, something continues, dreams flicker, the brain processes, some minimal hum of awareness persists. But what we're exploring tonight exists beyond that constant presence. Some meditators, after years of practice, report experiencing something called cessation. It's not sleep, it's not unconsciousness in the way anesthesia creates. It's described as a complete discontinuity. One moment there's experience, and the next moment there's nothing. Then awareness returns, with a gap in between that can't be remembered because there was no one there to remember it. This isn't mysticism or metaphor. It's a documented phenomenon, studied in laboratories, described with remarkable consistency across different meditation traditions and cultures. Scientists have measured brain activity during these states. Practitioners have mapped the territory leading to this edge. Tonight, we're going to explore this strange capability at the boundary of human consciousness. What it means that awareness can switch off and return, what happens in that gap, and what this possibility suggests about the nature of mind itself. Close your eyes for a moment if you're comfortable doing so. Notice what's there. Even in darkness, even in silence, something persists, a sense of presence, of being here, of existing as a point of awareness in space and time. This presence never actually stops. From the moment consciousness emerges in early childhood until the moment it finally ends, something continues. Even when you sleep, research shows the brain maintains what neuroscientists call a baseline state, a low hum of activity that processes memories, monitors the environment for threats, and generates the strange theater of dreams, the default mode network, a constellation of brain regions most active when we're not focused on external tasks. Consumes remarkable energy even at rest. It creates the ongoing narrative of self, linking past to future, maintaining the story of who you are. This network quiets somewhat during deep sleep, but it doesn't fully switch off. Dreaming proves this. Even in sleep's deepest phases, experience continues in transformed ways. What's extraordinary isn't that consciousness persists during sleep. It's that we've come to assume consciousness must always persist in some form. The idea that awareness could completely cease and then resume seems to violate something fundamental about what we are. Think about your own experience. Can you remember a single moment when you weren't aware of something? When you try to recall deep sleep, you might remember the moments before and after, but the sleep itself appears as a blank. Yet that blank isn't truly nothing. It's simply memory's failure to record the low-level processing that continued all night. Brain imaging during sleep reveals waves of activity moving through the cortex, the thalamus rhythmically gating sensory information, the hippocampus replaying the day's experiences. Even dreamless sleep contains minimal phenomenology. Researchers who wake people during deep sleep sometimes get reports of vague sensations, floating thoughts, or dim awareness of time passing. This continuous baseline matters because it establishes what normal consciousness looks like from a neurological perspective. The brain never fully powers down. Even in coma states, depending on severity, some regions maintain activity. The complete cessation that certain meditators report represents something different from any naturally occurring state. Some traditions describe consciousness as a stream, William James's famous metaphor. Water flowing continuously, sometimes turbulent, sometimes calm, but always moving. What we're exploring tonight suggests that stream might not be as constant as it appears. Under specific conditions, through deliberate training, the flow might actually stop, not divert into sleep's altered channel, but genuinely cease. This possibility raises unsettling questions. If consciousness can stop and restart, what does that mean about its nature? Is awareness something the brain does, like breathing, that can be paused? Or is there something more mysterious happening when that gap appears? Sitting quietly right now, listening to these words, you might feel relatively calm. Your body settled, breathing steady, attention gently held. But inside your skull, an astonishing amount is happening. Your resting brain uses about 20% of your body's total energy, far more than its weight would suggest necessary. Most of that energy doesn't go toward processing these words or tracking sounds in your environment. It goes toward the brain talking to itself, maintaining elaborate internal simulations, generating that continuous sense of self. When researchers first measured brain activity during rest, they expected to find minimal energy use. Instead, they discovered intense activity in specific networks, especially the regions along the brain's midline, areas involved in remembering the past, imagining the future, and creating the ongoing narrative of identity. This system, the default mode network, becomes more active when we're not focused on external tasks. Think about what happens when you try to sit still and do nothing. Within seconds, thoughts appear, plans for tomorrow, memories from yesterday, imagined conversations, worries, hopes, random songs, fragments of ideas. This isn't distraction, it's the brain's default state, what it naturally does when not engaged with the world. The energy cost of this internal activity is substantial. Your brain generates perhaps 50,000 thoughts per day, most of them repetitive, many of them about yourself, who you are, what others think of you, what might happen, what did happen, what should have happened differently. This constant self-referential processing creates and maintains the feeling of being a continuous person across time. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as the brain's predictive function. It's constantly building models of the future based on the past, updating the story of who you are, maintaining the coherent narrative that makes navigating social life possible. But this function comes at a cost. The ongoing maintenance of self requires tremendous energy and never really stops. Even when you think you're resting, the default mode network continues its work. Close your eyes during the day and you might notice this more clearly. The moment external focus disappears, internal chatter emerges. Where was I in that conversation? What do I need to do later? Did I remember to send that email? The brain fills the space. What's fascinating is that this activity isn't just random noise. It serves purposes, consolidating memories, planning, social reasoning, but it also creates a kind of background burden, a constant hum of self-maintenance that we rarely notice because it's always there. We've never experienced its absence. Advanced meditators often describe ordinary mind as exhausting, not in a way non-meditators consciously feel, but in retrospect, after experiencing states with less self-referential activity. They report that the continuous maintenance of identity, the endless story building, carries a subtle weight that becomes apparent only when it's reduced. This suggests something counterintuitive. Stillness isn't our natural state. The quiet mind requires effort or training. Left to itself, consciousness bubbles with activity, maintaining the elaborate construction we call self. What appears peaceful on the outside masks remarkable complexity within. Focus your attention on your breath for just 10 seconds. Notice what happens. For the first second or two, attention might genuinely rest on the sensation of breathing, but then, almost inevitably, something else appears. A thought, a sound, a sensation somewhere in your body. Attention flickers, following whatever seems most interesting or urgent. Bringing it back requires effort, and even then, it rarely stays settled for long. This restlessness reveals something fundamental about ordinary consciousness. Attention is remarkably narrow and easily captured. Despite feeling like we're aware of everything around us, research shows we can truly focus on only about one thing at a time. Everything else exists as peripheral awareness, monitored but not fully experienced. The brain's attentional system evolved to detect change and novelty, anything that might represent threat or opportunity. This made survival sense in ancestral environments, but it means attention constantly seeks new stimuli. Sitting still, deliberately focusing on something unchanging like breath, goes against this natural tendency. Meditation traditions discovered that attention can be trained. With practice, the mind's natural restlessness gradually settles, focus strengthens, becoming capable of resting on a single object for longer periods. This isn't suppression, thoughts still arise, but the relationship with them changes. Attention learns to stay anchored while disturbances pass through without capturing it. Neuroscientists studying long-term meditators find structural changes in brain regions related to attention control. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in conflict monitoring and attention regulation, shows increased density. Networks connecting attention centers become more efficient. The brain physically reorganizes around the practice of sustained focus. What emerges with this training is a different kind of consciousness, quieter, more stable, less reactive. The usual chaos of thoughts and sensations continues, but they no longer dominate experience in the same way. There's space around them, a quality of awareness that can observe mental activity without being pulled into it. This matters for understanding cessation because deep focus represents the first step towards stranger states. As attention stabilizes, something else becomes possible, states called jhanas in Buddhist terminology, or absorption states in modern psychology. These involve consciousness narrowing to a single point with unusual intensity. During absorption, the sense of being a separate self-observing can temporarily dissolve. There's just the object of attention, a sensation, a visual point, an idea, experienced directly without the usual layer of self-referential processing. The default mode network quiets significantly. The internal narrator goes silent. Researchers measuring brain activity during these states find patterns unlike normal waking consciousness or sleep. Certain frequencies of neural oscillation increase while others decrease. The typical communication between brain regions changes, with some areas becoming temporarily isolated from their usual networks. These absorption states hint at consciousness's flexibility. What seems solid and unchanging, the continuous sense of being yourself, aware and present, can actually shift into radically different configurations. Attention, trained and focused, opens doorways to experiences outside ordinary mental life, and absorption, as deep as it gets, still contains experience. There's still something it's like to be in that state. Cessation, by contrast, involves attention not just narrowing, but somehow crossing a threshold where experience itself stops. Not focusing on nothing, but the actual absence of any experiencing at all. Every night you cross a boundary. Consciousness shifts from waking awareness into something stranger, sleep, where time behaves differently, logic dissolves, and impossible things seem normal. But sleep isn't unconsciousness. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what cessation might be. Dreams prove this most obviously. During REM sleep, the brain generates vivid experiences, narratives, emotions, sensations as real feeling as waking life. You're aware during dreams, even if that awareness differs from waking consciousness. You experience events, react to situations, feel emotions. Something very much like consciousness continues, just in a different mode. Even outside a REM sleep, research suggests awareness doesn't fully vanish. When people are awakened from deep sleep stages, they sometimes report vague impressions, a sense of time passing, dim thoughts, floating sensations. The content differs dramatically from dreams, but it's not absolute nothing. Sleep architecture involves cycling through stages, each with distinct brain activity patterns. Stage 1 is light sleep, easily disturbed. Stage 2 shows specific waveforms called sleep spindles and K-complexes, thought to be involved in memory consolidation. Stages 3 and 4 represent deep sleep, characterized by slow, high-amplitude delta waves rolling through the cortex. Throughout all this, the thalamus, a structure deep in the brain that gates sensory information, reduces input from the outside world. But it doesn't shut down completely. The sleeping brain still monitors the environment. A mother wakes to her baby's cry while sleeping through louder street noise. Some part of awareness continues evaluating stimuli for significance. What we call dreamless sleep likely contains more experience than we remember. Memory formation is impaired during sleep, so the absence of recall doesn't necessarily mean absence of experience. You might have vague sensations or thoughts during deep sleep that simply never get encoded into retrievable memory. The boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness isn't sharp. Hypnagogia, the transition state while falling asleep, blends elements of both. You might experience strange thoughts, visual patterns, or brief dreams while still partly aware of your surroundings. Similarly, hypnopompia upon waking sometimes carries dream fragments into waking awareness. These transitions reveal consciousness as something gradual rather than binary. You don't switch instantly from awake to asleep. You drift through intermediate states where qualities of both modes coexist. This gradualness characterizes most natural changes in consciousness, which makes cessation's reported discontinuity so striking. Meditators describe it not as gradual fading, but as instantaneous cut, consciousness present, then gap, then consciousness returning, no transition state, no intermediate zone. More like turning off a light than dimming it slowly. Sleep also differs from cessation in aftermath. Waking from sleep, even deep sleep, usually brings grogginess, disorientation, a gradual return to full waking consciousness. Dreams might be remembered or lost. The transition takes time. Cessation, by contrast, is often described as leaving profound clarity or bliss. Despite nothing being experienced during the gap itself, practitioners report feeling refreshed, peaceful, or subtly transformed. The discontinuity seems to produce effects that ordinary sleep doesn't. This comparison helps define what cessation isn't. It's not sleep, not dreaming, not the natural cycling of consciousness through daily rhythms. It represents something different, a possibility the brain doesn't usually access but can learn to reach through deliberate training. Consciousness studying itself creates a peculiar paradox. The moment awareness turns inward to examine its own nature, it changes what it's examining. Think about trying to observe your thoughts. The instant you notice a thought, you've already shifted into a different mode. Now there's the thought and the awareness watching the thought. Two layers where before there was just one. And then you might notice the watching, creating a third layer, awareness of being aware of being aware. The recursion can continue, each level of observation altering what came before. This problem haunts consciousness research. Unlike studying external objects, which remain relatively stable under observation, consciousness transforms in the act of being examined. Trying to catch awareness in its natural state is like trying to see your eyes without a mirror. The tool of observation is the thing being observed. Neuroscientists face this when studying meditation states. Asking someone, "What are you experiencing right now?" immediately changes their experience. The question pulls attention toward reporting, toward language, toward the social act of communication. The pure state, whatever it was, gets modified by the investigation itself. For cessation, this problem becomes especially acute. How can anyone report experiencing nothing? To remember something requires forming a memory, which requires some minimal experience. If consciousness genuinely ceases, there should be nothing to remember, nothing to report. Yet people do report cessation, describing it consistently across traditions and individuals. The logical puzzle is this. If you experienced the gap, it wasn't true cessation, some minimal awareness remained to register it. But if you didn't experience it, how do you know it happened? What makes cessation different from simply not remembering a period of time? Meditators address this by pointing to the discontinuity itself as the evidence. Before cessation, you're aware of being in meditation. After cessation, you're aware again, but there's a clear sense of time having jumped, of experience having stopped and restarted. The gap makes itself known not through memory of itself, but through the jarring absence where continuity should be. Consider ordinary experience. Even when you're not paying attention, consciousness flows continuously. If someone asks what you were thinking 5 minutes ago, you might not remember exactly, but you don't feel like you stopped existing. With cessation, practitioners report something fundamentally different, a distinct sense that they weren't there for a period. That experience genuinely ceased. This gets philosophically complex. Some traditions argue that reporting cessation proves it isn't complete. There must be a subtle witness remaining, some level of consciousness that continues even in apparent absence. Others counter that memory can form in the moments immediately after, recognizing the discontinuity retrospectively without requiring awareness during the gap itself. Western philosophy has long debated whether consciousness can observe itself neutrally. Kant argued there are fundamental limits to self-knowledge. The subject can never fully become its own object. Phenomenologists try to develop methods for pure description of experience, but always face the observer problem. What makes cessation fascinating philosophically is that it might sidestep this issue entirely. Instead of consciousness trying to observe itself, it simply stops. The investigation happens afterward, examining the gap from outside it. The paradox dissolves because there's no attempt to be aware of awareness during cessation, only recognizing its absence upon return. Still, questions remain. What exactly experiences the return? If consciousness ceased completely, what mechanism initiates its resumption? These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They point to genuine mysteries about how awareness works, what maintains it, and what allows it to stop and start. Consciousness doesn't exist in just two states, on or off. It occupies a vast spectrum, varying in depth, clarity, content, and quality. Consider the range you experience in ordinary life. There's the sharp, focused awareness during an engaging conversation, the diffuse, dreamy state while staring out a window, the narrow concentration of reading something difficult, the expansive openness of walking in nature. Each represents a different configuration of consciousness, different qualities of awareness. Adding meditation to this picture expands the spectrum dramatically. Contemplative traditions have mapped territories of consciousness that most people never encounter, developing detailed cartographies of internal states. Early meditation often reveals how chaotic ordinary mind is, thoughts jumping randomly, attention scattered, awareness fragmented. This baseline state, while normal, represents just one possibility among many. With practice, consciousness can stabilize into clearer, calmer configurations. Attention becomes more continuous, less pulled by every passing stimulus. The space between thoughts widens. There's more awareness of awareness itself, a quality of presence that watches mental activity without being swept into it. Deeper still, meditation can lead to absorption states where consciousness narrows to a single point. The external world fades, time sense changes, the boundaries between observer and observed blur. In these jhana states, awareness becomes remarkably concentrated, unified, sometimes accompanied by intense bliss or peace. Buddhist texts describe 8 progressive jhanas, each deeper and more refined than the last. The first 4 involve form. There's still an object of attention, still a sense of experiencing something. The next 4 move into formless territories, consciousness focusing on infinite space, infinite consciousness itself, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. These descriptions might sound abstract or mystical, but meditators across traditions report remarkably similar experiences. The phenomenology is consistent enough that neuroscientists have begun mapping these states, finding distinct brain patterns for different depths of meditation. What emerges is a landscape where consciousness has more range than commonly assumed. Like an instrument capable of many notes, awareness can tune itself to different frequencies, each revealing different aspects of mind. Cessation, in this framework, represents an edge beyond even the deepest states. After the 8th jhana comes a 9th, Nirodha Samapatti, cessation attainment, not a deeper absorption but something categorically different. Consciousness not just refined but stopped. This positioning matters. Cessation isn't presented as the first or most accessible state. It comes after extensive training, after mastering progressively deeper levels of concentration and insight. The spectrum builds toward this threshold, each stage developing capacities necessary for the next. Understanding this progression helps contextualize what cessation might be. It's not a random anomaly, but perhaps the natural endpoint of a process. Consciousness learning to quiet itself so completely that it finally switches off. Different traditions emphasize different parts of this spectrum. Some focus on concentration states, others on insight practices that observe experiences arising and passing. Some integrate both, seeing concentration and insight as complementary paths toward the same deep territory. Modern psychology has barely begun mapping these states. Most research focuses on ordinary waking consciousness and sleep, with meditation viewed as relaxation or stress reduction. But practitioners treating meditation seriously as investigation have accumulated knowledge neuroscience is only now catching up to. The spectrum metaphor has limits. These aren't points on a line, but complex, multidimensional states. Still, it captures something true. Consciousness has range we rarely explore, depths we don't usually reach, possibilities beyond what ordinary experience suggests. There's a threshold. Those who've approached it describe something distinctive, a particular quality of experience that signals consciousness nearing its own edge. The moments before cessation often involve heightened clarity. Perception sharpens, becoming almost crystalline. Colors appear more vivid, sounds more distinct, sensations more precise. The mind quiets to unusual stillness, yet remains alertly present, not dull or drowsy, but intensely clear. Many practitioners report a sense of acceleration or gathering intensity. Mental activity doesn't increase, it decreases, but there's a feeling of something building, approaching, like standing at a cliff's edge sensing the drop before you. Some describe it as vibrational, a very high-frequency buzzing or vibration throughout the body, or in consciousness itself. This isn't metaphorical. It's reported as an actual felt sensation, something like extreme energy moving very rapidly while everything else remains still. Others notice time beginning to behave strangely. Moments stretch or compress. The usual flow of experience starts fragmenting into discrete instants, like watching a film where you can perceive individual frames rather than continuous motion. Often there's what meditators call fear arising. Not exactly fear in the normal sense, but a deep instinctual response to approaching something unknown and radical. The body or mind recognizes that ordinary consciousness is about to stop, and some primitive survival mechanism activates, trying to prevent it. Working through this threshold, fear becomes part of the practice, the mechanism that maintains consciousness, that keeps the self-system running continuously, resists its own cessation. It takes repeated approaches, building trust that cessation is safe, before that resistance releases. Another common pre-cessation experience involves the sense of self becoming very subtle. The usual feeling of being someone located behind your eyes, thinking thoughts, making decisions. That structure thins. There's awareness, but less sense of a particular person having it. Phenomenologically, it's described as getting very quiet and very fast simultaneously. The content of consciousness reduces to almost nothing, while the clarity or intensity increases dramatically, like turning down the volume while sharpening the signal. This threshold state has recognizable markers. Experienced practitioners can feel when they're approaching it, though there's no forcing the transition. You can't make cessation happen, you can only create conditions and allow it if it comes. The approach involves letting go at deeper and deeper levels. First, letting go of thoughts, then letting go of the watching of thoughts, then letting go of the sense of being someone who lets go. Each release brings consciousness closer to the edge. Some teachers describe it as consciousness investigating its own foundation, looking deeper and deeper into what's aware, until it examines the very base that awareness rests on. And in that moment of looking at its own ground, something shifts. The moments immediately before are sometimes described as the most intense part of the entire practice. There's nothing else quite like it in human experience, approaching the cessation of your own awareness while still conscious enough to recognize what's happening. And then there's a blink. Not a slow fade, not a gradual transition. One moment consciousness is there, next moment there's a gap, and then consciousness returns, finding itself on the other side of something it can't remember crossing. Imagine watching a film when suddenly a frame is missing. Not a gradual fade to black, not a slow transition. One image, then the next, with a missing instant between them that you can sense but not recover. Cessation works like that. But instead of missing film, it's missing experience. Meditators describe it with remarkable consistency. Consciousness is present, engaged in meditation, clearly aware. Then there's a gap. No memories form, no time is experienced. Nothing happens from the inside. Then consciousness returns, aware once again, but with the unmistakable sense that continuity was broken. This discontinuity differs from anything else in ordinary experience. When you forget something, there's usually a sense that time passed even if you can't recall what happened. When you sleep, there's a transition into and out of it. When you zone out during a boring task, you can often reconstruct roughly how long you were distracted. Cessation offers none of that. The gap reveals itself not through memory but through its absence. A clean cut where the continuous stream should be. The duration from the outside can be measured. Observers watching meditators report pauses in breathing, subtle changes in posture, periods lasting seconds to minutes, but from the inside there's no duration at all. Time doesn't pass slowly or quickly. It doesn't register as passing. This creates a strange asymmetry. If you observe someone experiencing cessation, you see continuous time with them sitting there for, say, 20 seconds. If you're the one experiencing it, there are 2 moments of consciousness with nothing in between, no matter how long the gap lasted externally. Think about the implications. Every other mental state has phenomenology, something it's like to be in it. Sleep has dreams and vague sensations. Anesthesia has the transitional moments before and after. Even profound unconsciousness in coma might have minimal experience we simply can't access or report. Cessation appears to have no phenomenology at all. There's nothing it's like to be in cessation because there's no one there to experience it. Consciousness genuinely stops, creating actual discontinuity in the stream of awareness that normally runs without interruption from birth to death. This raises fascinating questions about personal identity. If consciousness can stop and restart, what maintains continuity across that gap? When you return, what makes you the same person who entered cessation? Memory can't bridge it. No memory forms during the absence. Bodily continuity exists. But if identity depends on consciousness, what survives the discontinuity? Some philosophical traditions would argue this proves the self is constructed rather than inherent. The fact that consciousness can switch off and return suggests it's more like a process than an entity. Something the brain does that can start and stop, rather than something fundamental that merely changes states. Western philosophy has long assumed consciousness must be continuous to support personal identity. Locke argued that continuity of consciousness makes you the same person over time. Hume countered that the self is just a bundle of perceptions, but even his bundle implied ongoing experience. Cessation challenges both views. It suggests consciousness can be genuinely discontinuous while the person continues across the gap. Whatever maintains identity might not require unbroken awareness. Some deeper continuity exists below the level consciousness occupies. Neuroscientists studying this phenomenon note that brain activity doesn't cease entirely, even during reported cessation. Some baseline functions continue: brainstem regulation, autonomic processes, but the regions associated with conscious experience, self-reference, and awareness itself show dramatic reduction in activity. What returns after the gap often feels profoundly different, even though it's recognizably you. There's a sense of freshness, of relief, sometimes of joy, despite nothing happening during cessation that could produce those feelings. Here's the puzzle. Nothing happened, yet everything feels different. People emerging from cessation often report profound bliss, relief, or clarity, even though they experienced nothing during the gap itself. How can absence produce such positive effects? One explanation involves the burden of consciousness we don't usually notice. The brain continuously maintains the self-structure, updating your story, monitoring your social standing, planning for future threats, replaying past mistakes. This maintenance runs in the background, so constant we don't realize how much energy it consumes. Cessation might be like finally putting down a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there. When consciousness stops, all that self-maintenance stops too. Upon return, there's a felt sense of relief, not from any positive experience during cessation, but from the absence of the usual burden. Think about deep sleep. You don't experience anything positive during it, yet waking rested feels wonderful. The benefit comes from what didn't happen, the restoration, the break from waking consciousness's demands. Cessation might function similarly, but more completely. Another aspect involves contrast. Ordinary consciousness contains subtle tension, the sense of being someone maintaining themselves through time, managing existence, staying coherent. We're so used to this tension we don't feel it as tension. But after cessation, returning to ordinary consciousness, many people report suddenly noticing that background tightness, seeing how much effort the mind normally exerts. Some describe it as consciousness rebooting, like restarting a computer that's been running sluggishly. Cessation seems to reset something fundamental. The same processes resume, but fresher, clearer, less encumbered by accumulated patterns. The bliss often reported isn't ecstatic or exciting. It's described as deeply peaceful, almost relief-based. A sense of profound okayness, like something you didn't know was wrong just corrected itself. This quality suggests the effect comes from release rather than acquisition. Neurologically, this aftermath might involve the default mode network returning to operation but temporarily less rigid in its patterns. If cessation represents complete DMN shutdown, the network's restart might happen with reduced habitual activity, creating a window of unusual mental freedom. Studies of meditation show that even brief states can have lasting effects. A few minutes in deep absorption can influence mood and attention for hours afterward. Cessation, being more complete, might create even stronger after effects despite containing no experience itself. There's also a psychological component. Experiencing consciousness actually stopping can be transformative simply as knowledge. You directly discover that awareness isn't as solid or continuous as it seemed. This realization, not intellectual but experiential, can shift your relationship with mind. Many practitioners describe feeling less identified with their thoughts after cessation. If consciousness can completely cease and then return, thoughts and emotions appear more clearly as passing events rather than definitive aspects of self. The distance this creates reduces suffering. Some report decreased anxiety, particularly around death. If consciousness has already stopped once, completely, and then resumed, the fear of its permanent cessation loses some power. You've touched that absence and come back. It wasn't painful or scary, just gap. Others notice increased peace with uncertainty. If the thing you call you can switch off and restart, fixating on controlling every aspect of life feels less urgent. There's a loosening, a trust that even discontinuity isn't catastrophic. The aftermath can also include confusion or integration challenges. Experiencing cessation doesn't automatically resolve all psychological issues. Some people struggle with what it means, how to talk about it, whether pursuing it again is wise. But the consistent thread is that absence, paradoxically, produces presence of a different quality. Clearer, lighter, less defended. Nothing happened, yet somehow that nothing changes how consciousness operates when it returns. In laboratories, scientists have begun measuring what happens in the brain during extreme meditative states. What they're finding suggests cessation might be traceable, even if it can't be experienced. Advanced meditators participating in fMRI and EEG studies show brain patterns unlike anything seen in ordinary waking or sleeping states. During deep absorption, the default mode network, that constellation of regions maintaining self-reference, shows dramatically reduced activity. In normal waking consciousness, the DMN is highly active, constantly processing information about self, past, and future. Even during focused tasks, it maintains a baseline hum. Sleep reduces this activity, but doesn't eliminate it. Anesthesia suppresses it more completely, but through chemical interference rather than trained voluntary control. In very deep meditation approaching cessation, researchers observe something remarkable. The DMN activity drops to levels barely above baseline noise. Regions that normally communicate constantly become functionally disconnected. The brain's self-referential processing appears to nearly stop. One hypothesis proposes that cessation represents complete, if temporary, DMN shutdown. The network responsible for maintaining the sense of continuous personal identity simply goes offline. With no self-maintenance system running, consciousness is nothing to anchor to and ceases. This theory has appeal because it links subjective reports with measurable neural activity. The experience of self-vanishing and consciousness stopping would correspond to the very network that generates those experiences shutting down. Supporting this, meditators describe the progression towards cessation as involving the sense of self becoming progressively subtler and finally disappearing. If the DMN is indeed what constructs the feeling of being a persisting self, its shutdown would explain that phenomenology precisely. However, mysteries remain. The DMN doesn't operate alone. It interacts with other brain networks, including those governing attention, sensory processing, and basic arousal. Complete cessation would require more than just DMN shutdown. It would need a broader systems collapse of the mechanisms maintaining conscious awareness. EEG studies during deep meditation show unusual patterns in neural oscillations. Theta waves, typically associated with light sleep and meditation, sometimes dominate. But approaching cessation, some meditators show extremely high-frequency gamma oscillations, patterns associated with heightened integration of information across brain regions. This seems paradoxical. High gamma coherence usually correlates with intense awareness, yet meditators report it occurring just before consciousness ceases entirely. One interpretation is that this represents a kind of critical state, the brain highly synchronized before the synchronized activity collapses into cessation. The thalamus, deep in the brain, acts as a relay station gating sensory information to the cortex. During sleep, thalamic activity reduces, filtering out external stimuli. Some researchers speculate that advanced meditation might enable conscious control of thalamic gating, progressively reducing input until consciousness itself switches off. Another piece involves neurotransmitter systems. GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, plays roles in calming neural activity. Meditation increases GABA levels, which might facilitate the deep quieting necessary for cessation. Serotonin and dopamine systems also show alterations in long-term meditators, potentially contributing to the unusual states they can access. But neuroscience faces fundamental challenges studying cessation directly. The most profound moment, consciousness actually stopping, produces no reportable data because there's no conscious subject to report it. Researchers measure before and after, catching glimpses of approach and aftermath, but the gap itself remains neurally opaque. What can be studied is the correlation between brain states and practitioners' reports of how close they are to cessation. Certain neural signatures appear to predict approach. Whether those signatures continue into actual cessation remains unknown. By the time consciousness returns to report the gap, the brain state has already changed. Still, the research suggests something real and measurable corresponds to what meditators describe. Cessation isn't purely subjective or cultural, it correlates with specific, reproducible brain changes that distinguish it from other states. Here's what makes cessation scientifically intriguing. People from vastly different backgrounds describe it nearly identically. Theravada Buddhists practicing in Myanmar, Zen practitioners in Japan, secular meditators in American laboratories. Across cultures, languages, and belief systems, the reports converge on the same core features: sudden discontinuity, no memory of the gap, immediate recognition upon return that consciousness ceased. This consistency stands in stark contrast to most mystical or religious experiences, which vary wildly based on cultural context. Visions of deities, feelings of cosmic unity, encounters with spiritual entities, these take forms deeply shaped by beliefs and expectations. But cessation strips away cultural content. There's nothing to experience during it, so nothing for culture to color. The gap is just gap, whether you're Buddhist, atheist, or anything else. The aftermath might be interpreted differently, one person seeing it as evidence of no self, another as neurological quirk, but the core event remains recognizably the same. This reproducibility suggests we're dealing with a genuine capacity of human neurology rather than cultural construction. The brain, trained in specific ways, can reach a state where conscious experience temporarily stops. Different traditions have independently discovered this possibility and developed methods to access it. Historical texts provide evidence of long lineage. The Pali Canon, written over 2,000 years ago, describes Nirodha Samapatti with remarkable specificity. The phenomenology matches modern reports, complete cessation of perception and feeling, no experience during, profound peace afterward. Zen texts, though less explicit, contain references to states beyond ordinary meditation, where not even emptiness remains. While interpretations vary, some scholars argue these point to similar cessation experiences. Even outside Buddhist contexts, Christian mystics occasionally describe states of complete stillness, absolute silence, where even awareness of God temporarily disappears. While theologically framed differently, the phenomenology, consciousness stopping, appears consistent. Modern secular meditation teachers working with thousands of students report that cessation, while rare, follows predictable patterns. Certain practice stages lead to it. Specific markers indicate approach. The experience itself, when it occurs, matches what texts described centuries ago. This predictability extends to the practice path. Students following similar meditation instructions tend to progress through comparable stages before reaching cessation. The territory isn't arbitrary. It has structure that different people navigate similarly. Scientific studies, though limited, support reproducibility. When researchers identify meditators claiming cessation experience and study them, brain patterns show consistent differences from controls. The neural signatures aren't random. They cluster in ways suggesting common underlying mechanisms. Of course, not everyone who meditates reaches cessation. It appears to require substantial practice, thousands of hours for most people. But among those who dedicate that time and follow appropriate methods, the success rate is surprisingly consistent. This isn't one person's unique neurological quirk. It's a capability that emerges reliably with training. The consistency also appears in what doesn't happen. Meditators don't report gradual fading into cessation or slow emergence from it. They don't describe dreamlike content during the gap. They don't claim mystical encounters or spiritual revelations within the experience itself. The reports stay narrow and specific. Discontinuity, gap, return. This specificity actually strengthens the case for something real. If people were fabricating experiences based on cultural expectations, we'd expect more variation, more embellishment, more alignment with whatever spiritual framework they held. Instead, the reports remain almost boringly consistent. Still, questions remain about interpretation. Do all these similar reports necessarily indicate identical brain states? Could different neurological events produce the same phenomenological signature? Might cultural context shape the experience more subtly than obvious content? These concerns keep the mystery alive, but the reproducibility across contexts, across centuries, across different individuals and traditions, suggests cessation represents a genuine phenomenon, something the human brain can do under specific conditions, discoverable independently by different lineages investigating consciousness. From the outside, cessation has length. Observers can measure it: 15 seconds, 45 seconds, several minutes. Brain monitoring equipment records the duration between entering and emerging from the state. From the inside, there's no duration at all. This creates a strange split in how cessation exists. Objectively, it occupies time. Subjectively, it contains none. Both perspectives are real, yet they describe incompatible realities. The reason traces back to how consciousness measures time. We don't have a built-in clock reading out seconds. Instead, we perceive time through change, events succeeding one another, thoughts arising and passing, sensations shifting. The flow of experience itself creates the sense of time passing. Remove experience entirely, and time measurement disappears. If nothing changes in consciousness because consciousness isn't there, no duration can be felt. The gap between cessation beginning and ending contains zero subjective time because there's no subject present to experience any interval. This differs from how time works in other altered states. In dreams, time can stretch or compress, but there's still a sense of duration. Hours might feel like minutes, but the minutes are felt. In deep absorption states, time might seem to stop, but there's still the ongoing experience of absorption. Something happening, even if it's minimal. Cessation offers actual timelessness, not as a feeling but as a fact. Nothing happens, so nothing measures duration. The moments before and after exist, but between them, From the inside, there's no between. Philosophically, this touches ancient questions about time's nature. Does time exist independently, or is it something consciousness creates through experiencing succession? If consciousness stops, does time stop for that person, even while continuing for everyone else? Cessation suggests time might be more consciousness dependent than we assume. The universe continues, clocks tick, observers measure duration, but for the person in cessation, that interval simply doesn't exist as time. They jump from before to after with no traversing of the middle. This has strange implications. In some sense, you can't spend time in cessation because spending time requires experiencing time, which requires consciousness. You can only be absent for a duration that others measure but you never inhabit. Meditators sometimes report surprise at how long they were gone when told the measured duration. It felt instantaneous is common, but felt isn't quite right. There was no feeling. It's more accurate to say the gap revealed itself as having no experiential duration, though logical inference tells them time must have passed. This timelessness contributes to cessation's psychological impact. Touching a state where time genuinely doesn't exist, even briefly, can shift how you relate to time normally. The constant pressure of moments passing, deadlines approaching, life moving forward, all of that depends on consciousness being there to experience succession. Some practitioners describe reduced anxiety about death after experiencing cessation. Death involves time stopping for consciousness permanently, which sounds frightening, but cessation demonstrates that consciousness stopping doesn't feel like anything. There's no duration of being dead to endure, no eternal darkness to experience. It's simply absence, and absence has no time. The duration paradox also raises questions about what ends cessation. If there's no one present to decide to return, what brings consciousness back? Is it a preset timer in neural mechanisms? Does the body's need for attention pull awareness back? Does consciousness simply have a natural cycle, stopping and restarting without any decision involved? Current neuroscience can't fully answer this. The mechanisms that maintain consciousness remain mysterious, so the mechanisms that can stop and restart it are even more so. We can observe that it happens, measure roughly how long, but the actual transition points, consciousness ceasing and resuming, remain neurally invisible. What's clear is that cessation reveals time as bound to experience in ways our normal sense of continuous existence obscures. Duration requires someone to endure it. Without that someone, time might continue objectively but disappears subjectively, creating a paradox where both realities are true simultaneously. 25 centuries ago, contemplatives in India began systematically mapping consciousness with remarkable precision. Their method was direct. Observe the mind carefully, note what appears and changes, trace patterns through years of continuous investigation. These early explorers discovered that meditation could progress through stages, each with characteristic features. They documented progression from scattered attention to stable focus to increasingly refined absorption states. And at the edge of this progression, they described something radical. Nirodha Samapatti, the attainment of cessation. The Pali Canon, Buddhism's earliest texts, describes cessation as the ninth and final jhana, a state beyond even the formless absorptions. Getting there required mastering the previous 8 jhanas in sequence, each preparing consciousness for the next level of refinement. The first 4 jhanas involve form, consciousness absorbed in physical sensations, often bliss or profound calm, but still oriented towards something concrete. Meditators describe intense pleasure in early jhanas, gradually giving way to deeper equanimity and stillness. The next 4 jhanas move beyond form into progressively more abstract territories. The 5th focuses on infinite space, consciousness expanded without boundaries, no objects anywhere. The 6th turns to infinite consciousness itself, awareness aware of its own boundless nature. The 7th jhana contemplates nothingness, not objects in empty space, not even awareness of space, but consciousness focused on the absence of anything. Meditators describe this as profoundly peaceful, but so subtle it's difficult to maintain. The 8th jhana reaches neither perception nor non-perception. a state so refined that you can't quite say experience is happening, yet you can't say it's not. Consciousness becomes so subtle it approaches the edge of its own possibility. And then comes the ninth, Nirodha Samapatti, not a refinement but a threshold. Consciousness doesn't become subtler, it ceases entirely. The progression through increasingly subtle states culminates in no state at all. The texts specify conditions for accessing this. Practitioners needed mastery of both concentration and insight. Concentration provided the stability to reach deep absorption. Insight provided understanding of experience's constructed nature, allowing the mind to release even the subtlest attachments to experience itself. Traditional instructions emphasized that cessation couldn't be forced. Unlike earlier jhanas, which involved directing attention towards specific objects or qualities, cessation required releasing all direction, all intention, all doing. The practitioner set up conditions, then simply let go. If cessation came, it came. If not, forcing wouldn't help. The aftermath was considered significant. Emerging from cessation, practitioners supposedly achieved one of Buddhism's major attainment levels, becoming anagami, a non-returner, or even arahant, fully enlightened. The experience proved experientially that consciousness is constructed, impermanent, not self, Buddhism's core insights. What's remarkable is how precisely these ancient descriptions match modern reports. The progression through stages, the shift from form to formless, the threshold quality of approaching cessation, the inability to make it happen through will, all of this appears in contemporary accounts from people who've never read the ancient texts. This suggests the maps were accurate. The contemplatives who created them genuinely explored these territories and documented what they found. Across centuries, before neuroscience, before psychology, before any modern framework, they identified a specific capacity of human consciousness and created paths to access it. Different Buddhist traditions elaborated on the basic maps. Theravada focused heavily on concentration and jhana progression. Zen emphasized sudden shifts, though some teachers acknowledge gradual preparation underlying apparent suddenness. Tibetan traditions integrated visualization and deity yoga, creating different routes towards similar deep states. But the core phenomenon, consciousness capable of completely ceasing and resuming, appears across these variations. The paths differ, the frameworks diverge, yet the destination they describe remains recognizably the same. In recent decades, something interesting happened. Meditation teachers began collaborating with neuroscientists, bringing ancient practices into laboratories and submitting their claims to modern measurement. Daniel Ingram, an emergency room physician and long-term meditation practitioner, wrote openly about his own cessation experiences and worked to demystify them. Rather than treating advanced meditation states as ineffable or purely spiritual, he described them in plain language, emphasizing reproducibility and systematic practice. Ingram's approach challenged both traditional secrecy around advanced practices and modern assumptions that such states were merely religious belief. He argued cessation was a real, trainable phenomenon that anyone with sufficient dedication could reach, regardless of spiritual framework. Shinzen Young, another prominent meditation teacher, developed systems for teaching concentration and insight practices to Western students and collaborated with researchers studying consciousness. His background in mathematics and Asian languages allowed him to bridge contemplative and scientific vocabularies, translating traditional phenomenology into terms neuroscientists could operationalize. Young emphasized the sensory clarity that advanced meditation develops, the ability to observe mental and physical phenomena with high resolution. This clarity, he suggested, made it possible to notice details about consciousness that ordinary introspection missed, including the fine-grained shifts approaching cessation. Meanwhile, researchers like Judson Brewer at Brown University and Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin began serious study of advanced meditators. Instead of treating meditation as simple relaxation, they recognized some practitioners had trained their minds to access unusual states worthy of investigation. Early findings surprised many neuroscientists. Long-term meditators showed structural brain differences, increased density in attention-related regions, altered connectivity between networks, heightened gamma wave coherence, these weren't subtle effects. They represented significant neuroplasticity resulting from intensive mental training. As trust built between contemplative and scientific communities, more advanced practitioners agreed to participate in studies while approaching or experiencing deep states. Laboratory settings aren't ideal for meditation. Lying in an fMRI scanner is quite different from sitting peacefully in a quiet room. But even under those constraints, unusual brain patterns emerged. One challenge is that cessation itself, being experienceless, can't be reported during the event. Researchers must rely on practitioners' retrospective reports and correlate them with what brain imaging showed. This indirect approach has limitations, but patterns have emerged. Before reported cessation, default mode network activity decreases dramatically. After return, practitioners show heightened activity in regions associated with effective processing, possibly correlating with the blissful aftermath many describe. During the gap itself, activity patterns suggest profound quieting. Though some baseline functions continue, the collaboration has also challenged both sides' assumptions. Meditators sometimes discover their subjective experience doesn't map neatly onto what brain imaging shows. Scientists sometimes find their categories for mental states inadequate for what advanced meditation reveals. Richie Davidson's long-term studies of Tibetan monks have been particularly illuminating. Some monks with decades of practice show brain patterns unlike any typically seen. Their baseline states differ from ordinary people's peak meditative states. Their capacity for regulating attention, emotion, and awareness extends far beyond normal human range. These findings suggest consciousness has more trainability than Western psychology assumed. What seemed like fixed limits of attention span, emotional regulation, or self-awareness turn out to be malleable with sufficient practice. The modern exploration also revealed gaps in traditional maps. Not every practitioner progresses identically. Some reach cessation without clearly passing through all traditional jhanas. Others experience stages the ancient maps don't describe. The territory is more variable than any single map captured. This ongoing collaboration continues revealing new details. As measurement tools improve and more practitioners participate, the neuroscience of cessation becomes increasingly sophisticated. Ancient phenomenology meets modern neuroscience, each tradition enriching the other, gradually building fuller understanding of consciousness's capabilities. Underneath every experience is a brain doing something. The question with cessation is, what exactly is the brain doing when consciousness stops? Current imaging technologies provide partial answers. fMRI measures blood flow, indicating which brain regions are more or less active. EEG measures electrical activity, showing wave patterns and rhythmic oscillations. Both offer windows into neural activity, though neither captures the full complexity of what's happening. During ordinary waking consciousness, the brain shows characteristic patterns. The default mode network, primarily medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and medial temporal regions, maintains high activity when not focused on external tasks. This network handles self-referential processing, autobiographical memory, and future planning. The salience network, involving anterior insular and anterior cingulate, monitors for important stimuli. The executive control network, including dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, manages attention and decision-making. These networks communicate constantly, creating the complex coordination underlying normal awareness. During focused meditation, this pattern shifts. The executive control network becomes more active as attention is deliberately directed. The default mode network quiets as self-referential thinking decreases. The salience network adjusts its monitoring based on meditation object, breath sensations, visual points, or internal states. In deeper absorption states, brain activity changes more dramatically. The default mode network activity drops substantially. Theta waves, slower oscillations between 4-8 Hz associated with light sleep and meditation, become prominent. Sometimes high-frequency gamma waves appear, suggesting intense neural synchronization. Approaching what meditators describe as cessation's threshold, several unusual patterns emerge. Some studies show brief periods of extremely high gamma coherence, many brain regions oscillating together at frequencies above 40 Hz. This typically indicates integrated information processing, yet occurs just before consciousness reportedly stops. One interpretation is that this represents a critical state, the brain highly synchronized before collapsing into cessation, like a system reaching maximum order right before transition to a different state entirely. The thalamus, deep in the brain's center, plays crucial roles in consciousness. It gates sensory information to the cortex, determining what reaches awareness. It also participates in generating rhythmic brain waves during sleep and potentially meditation. Some researchers speculate that extreme meditation might enable volitional control of thalamic gating, progressively filtering out all input until consciousness ceases. After reported cessation, brain patterns show interesting features. Many practitioners display increased activity in regions associated with reward and positive emotion, possibly correlating with the blissful aftermath. There's often continued reduced default mode network activity for a period, gradually returning to baseline, but neuroscience faces fundamental challenges studying cessation directly. The experience contains no reportable phenomenology, so researchers can't ask questions during it. They must measure brain states before and after, inferring what happened in between. This leaves the actual transition points, consciousness ceasing and resuming, neurally opaque. Moreover, consciousness's neural correlates remain deeply mysterious despite decades of research. We know many things that correlate with awareness: thalamocortical loops, cortical integration, specific frequency bands, but how physical processes generate subjective experience remains unexplained. This hard problem makes studying cessation's neuroscience especially difficult. What can be said is that deep meditation produces measurable brain states distinct from waking, sleeping, or ordinary relaxation. Advanced practitioners can voluntarily access these states, and the states correlate with specific subjective experiences. Whether cessation represents complete neural silence or just profound quieting remains uncertain. Some researchers propose that consciousness might not require all brain activity to cease, just the right activity in the right places. If the networks generating self-model and awareness substantially quiet, the result could be experiential cessation even while other neural functions continue. This fits with observations that meditators in cessation don't collapse unconscious. Some level of arousal and regulatory function persists, but the specific activity constituting conscious experience seems to stop, creating the gap practitioners report. The investigation continues as imaging improves, as more advanced practitioners participate in studies, as theoretical models of consciousness develop. Neuroscience may eventually explain how brains can stop consciousness temporarily and why that's possible. For now, it remains frontier territory where ancient practice and modern science are both still learning. If consciousness can completely cease and then return, what does this reveal about its nature? Philosophers have wrestled with awareness for millennia, and cessation brings fresh puzzles to ancient questions. Start with personal identity. Most theories assume some continuity of consciousness grounds the self across time. John Locke argued that continuous memory makes you the same person you were years ago. Without psychological continuity, identity breaks, but cessation interrupts continuity completely. There's no memory bridge across the gap because nothing happened to remember. Yet people clearly survive the interruption. Same body, same personality traits, same memories of everything before. They're obviously the same person after cessation as before. What then maintains identity if consciousness can be discontinuous? One response points to bodily continuity. Your physical brain persists through cessation, maintaining structures that encode memories, habits, and dispositions. When consciousness resumes, it resumes in the same neural substrate, so naturally feels like the same person. But this shifts identity from consciousness to physical substrate, which troubles theories holding that what you essentially are is your awareness, not your body. If consciousness is primary, its discontinuity should matter more than brain continuity. Another approach treats consciousness as a process rather than entity. Like a flame that can be extinguished and relit, consciousness is something the brain does, not something that exists independently. Processes can stop and restart without identity issues. The same fire can go out and be rekindled using the same fuel source. This processual view aligns with Buddhist metaphysics, which denies inherent self and treats identity as conventional designation. What we call person is a continuity of causal processes, not a metaphysical entity. Cessation simply makes this normally hidden truth temporarily obvious. Western philosophy has analogues. Hume's bundle theory treats the self as nothing more than bundled perceptions. When perceptions cease, the bundle temporarily doesn't exist. When they resume, the bundle reforms. No deep mystery, just the bundle's nature as conditional rather than intrinsic. But some find this unsatisfying. The subjective sense of being someone continuous feels undeniable. Cessation might interrupt awareness, but the I that enters seems identical to the I that returns. Where does that sameness reside if consciousness actually stopped? This touches the hard problem of consciousness: why and how physical processes generate subjective experience. If we can't explain why consciousness exists at all, explaining how it can temporarily not exist becomes even harder. Materialist views hold that consciousness is what certain brain processes feel like from inside. When those processes stop, consciousness stops. When they resume, it returns. No additional mystery. Consciousness is physical process, and physical processes can start and stop. But cessation's subjective quality challenges simple materialism. The gap isn't felt as anything. There's no what it's like to not be conscious, even though there's definitely what it's like to be conscious before and after. How does subjective experience arise from matter such that its absence creates a gap rather than a different experience? Idealist philosophies, which treat consciousness as fundamental rather than derivative, face different puzzles. If awareness is primary, what allows it to cease? What's the ground from which it emerges and to which it returns? Some idealist traditions propose levels of consciousness: surface awareness that can stop and deeper awareness that continues. But meditators describing cessation don't report witnessing it from a deeper level. They report genuine discontinuity, not observation from elsewhere. The duration paradox adds complexity. Cessation occupies objective time, but no subjective time. Does this mean time itself is consciousness dependent? Or does it mean there are two kinds of time, physical and experiential, that usually correlate but can come apart? Philosophers have long debated whether time is real or ideal, objective or constructed. Cessation suggests time might be partly both. Physical processes continue temporally, but subjective duration requires consciousness to experience it. Perhaps the deepest question is whether consciousness is more fragile than we thought. We assume awareness is robust, continuous, self-maintaining. Cessation demonstrates it can switch off entirely, suggesting it's conditional, dependent on specific causes that can be present or absent. This conditionality might be unsettling or liberating. Unsettling because it means the self you experience as constant can actually disappear. Liberating because what can stop might cause less suffering when you realize it's not as solid as it feels. Cessation isn't the only state where consciousness appears to stop. Other conditions create gaps in awareness, and comparing them helps clarify what makes meditative cessation distinctive. General anesthesia, for instance, produces unconsciousness reliably. Anesthesiologists can render patients completely unaware during surgery, with no memory formation and apparently no experience. In some ways, this resembles cessation: consciousness gone, then returned. But crucial differences emerge. Anesthesia is chemically induced, an external intervention suppressing neural activity. Cessation is achieved through training, a voluntary state entered through mental skill. The locus of control differs fundamentally. The transition also differs. Anesthesia typically involves gradual onset, initial sedation, progressive drowsiness, then unconsciousness. Recovery also takes time, often with confusion or grogginess. Cessation, by contrast, is described as instantaneous cut and immediate clear emergence. The aftermath diverges too. Anesthesia can leave people feeling foggy, tired, or disoriented for hours. Cessation frequently produces clarity, energy, or bliss. Despite both creating consciousness gaps, the effects on the person experiencing them differ markedly. Certain epileptic seizures create absence episodes, brief periods where consciousness seems to stop. The person stares blankly, doesn't respond, and afterward has no memory of the time. Brain activity during these absences shows specific patterns of abnormal neural firing. Again, similarities exist: discontinuity, no memory formation, gap in experience. But absent seizures are involuntary, pathological, and don't produce the peaceful aftermath cessation does. They're disruptions to normal function rather than achievements through training. Severe brain injuries can create states where consciousness appears absent. Vegetative states or comas represent profound unconsciousness, sometimes lasting months or years. Brain imaging shows reduced activity in consciousness-related regions. These conditions might seem like extended cessation, but they lack reversibility and voluntary control. They're not states entered through meditation and exited at will. They represent brain damage or dysfunction, not trained capacity. An interesting comparison is dreamless sleep, which most people experience nightly. During deep sleep stages, we typically form few if any memories and report minimal phenomenology if awakened. In some sense, consciousness seems absent or minimal, yet sleep differs from cessation in important ways. Sleep is a biological necessity the brain enters automatically. Cessation is entered through deliberate practice. Sleep follows circadian rhythms and serves restorative functions. Cessation doesn't appear to serve the same homeostatic purposes. Brain activity during deep sleep shows characteristic slow waves and reduced consciousness network activity, but not the complete quieting meditators report approaching cessation. Some baseline awareness likely continues in sleep, even if minimal and unremembered. Fainting creates brief unconsciousness from reduced blood flow to the brain. People lose consciousness suddenly, fall, and wake up moments later, often confused. There's a gap, but not one entered voluntarily or emerging with clarity. Psychedelic states sometimes include ego dissolution, where the sense of self temporarily disappears. This might seem related to cessation's loss of self-reference, but psychedelic states involve intense, unusual phenomenology, vivid experiences very different from cessation's reported absence of experience entirely. What distinguishes meditative cessation across these comparisons is the combination of voluntary control, immediate clear emergence, positive aftermath, and reproducibility through training. No other condition produces consciousness gaps with quite that profile. The closest analog might be certain advanced states in other contemplative traditions. Some Christian mystics describe union with God involving complete self-loss. Whether this involves actual consciousness cessation or profound absorption with minimal self-reference remains unclear. But the phenomenology shares features. Whirling dervishes in Sufi traditions report states of profound stillness within movement. Some descriptions hint at consciousness pausing, though the physical activity continues. This suggests bodily movement and awareness might partially decouple. Shamanic traditions worldwide describe journeys involving death and rebirth symbolism, sometimes including reports of consciousness stopping. Whether these represent genuine cessation or culturally interpreted altered states is difficult to determine from ethnographic accounts alone. What all this comparison reveals is that consciousness has multiple ways of stopping or appearing to stop. But meditative cessation occupies a unique position, voluntary, reproducible, controllable, and leaving practitioners feeling profoundly affected in positive ways. This distinctiveness suggests it's genuinely different from other gaps in awareness, worth studying on its own terms. Reaching cessation isn't accidental. Nearly everyone who reports experiencing it has invested thousands of hours in meditation practice, often over many years. The typical path begins with basic mindfulness, learning to observe thoughts and sensations without getting lost in them. This foundational skill feels simple but proves challenging. The mind resists observation, preferring to wander into planning, remembering, fantasizing, or worrying. Early practice often reveals how chaotic ordinary consciousness is. Sitting down to meditate for even 10 minutes, beginners discover attention scattering constantly, You intend to watch your breath, but within seconds you're thinking about dinner, replaying an earlier conversation, or wondering how much time has passed. This isn't failure, it's seeing clearly what the mind normally does. The chaos was always there, you're just noticing it for the first time. Progress begins with this noticing, this capacity to recognize when attention has wandered and gently return it. With sustained practice, concentration gradually improves. Minutes of continuous focus become possible, then longer periods. The gap between attention wandering and recognizing it has wandered shrinks. Gradually, consciousness stabilizes. Some practitioners focus heavily on concentration, developing ability to sustain attention on a single object, breath, visual point, mantra, for extended periods. This path leads toward absorption states, progressively deeper focus where awareness narrows and ordinary thought quiets. Others emphasize insight practices, observing experiences moment to moment arising and passing. This investigation gradually reveals consciousness's constructed nature, showing how sensations, thoughts, and even the sense of self are processes rather than stable entities. Most practitioners integrate both. Concentration provides stability necessary for deep investigation. Insight prevents concentration from becoming mere trance, keeping the practice directed toward understanding consciousness rather than just creating pleasant states. Progress isn't linear. There are periods of rapid development, plateaus where nothing seems to change, and sometimes regression where abilities temporarily decline. The path winds, sometimes frustratingly, toward deeper territories. Meditation retreats provide intensive training environments. Spending days or weeks in silence, meditating many hours daily, accelerates development. Under these conditions, consciousness can access states rarely reached in ordinary circumstances. It's during intensive retreat that many people first approach cessation. The combination of reduced sensory input, continuous practice, and temporary withdrawal from ordinary responsibilities creates conditions where consciousness can quiet more completely than usual. But even on retreat, cessation typically requires substantial prior experience. Beginning meditators rarely encounter it. The mind needs training before it can release deeply enough for consciousness to stop. Most estimates suggest at least 1,000 hours of practice, often several thousand, before cessation becomes accessible. This duration isn't arbitrary. The brain requires time to reorganize, to build new neural pathways supporting sustained focus and deep insight. Attention networks strengthen. Default mode activity learns to quiet. The capacity to let go of increasingly subtle aspects of experience develops gradually. Teachers often describe stages practitioners move through. Early stages involve learning basic concentration. Middle stages bring absorption states and insight into impermanence. Later stages include dissolution of self-perception and, potentially, cessation. These maps help practitioners recognize progress and understand challenges, but they're guides, not rigid prescriptions. Individual paths vary. Some people reach cessation without clearly experiencing all intermediate stages. Others experience stages the maps don't describe. What remains consistent is the requirement for dedication. No one stumbles into cessation casually. It emerges from sustained investigation. Thousands of hours spent training the mind to observe itself, to release control, to allow consciousness to quiet completely. For some practitioners, this investment feels natural. Meditation becomes central to life, the practice itself rewarding regardless of outcomes. For others, it's more challenging, requiring discipline to maintain when progress feels slow. But those who persist, who sit through boredom and restlessness and doubt, gradually develop capacities ordinary consciousness doesn't access. And sometimes, under the right conditions, with sufficient preparation, consciousness approaches its own edge and briefly switches off. Deep focus isn't natural for human minds. Our attention evolved to scan environments for threats and opportunities, not to rest steadily on single objects. Training concentration means working against evolutionary programming. The practice usually begins simply: choose an object, often breath, and return attention to it whenever the mind wanders. Sounds straightforward, but try it for 5 minutes and the difficulty becomes apparent. Breath offers advantages as meditation object. It's always present, doesn't require special conditions, and involves subtle enough sensations to keep attention engaged without overwhelming it. Following the in-breath, the pause, the out-breath, then again, creates rhythm that can carry awareness, but within moments, other things become more interesting. A sound in the environment, an itch, a thought about what you'll do later, a memory from yesterday. Attention follows whatever seems more compelling than breath. The instruction remains constant. Notice the wandering and return. No judgment, no frustration, just gentle redirection. This simple cycle, repeated thousands of times, gradually strengthens attention stability. As concentration develops, the mind settles into what's called access concentration, ability to maintain focus for extended periods with less effort. Attention stays with the breath more continuously. Distractions arise but don't pull awareness away as strongly. With access concentration established, deeper absorption states become possible. These jhanas involve consciousness narrowing dramatically, often accompanied by bliss, peace, or profound stillness. The first jhana typically includes rapture and pleasure alongside sustained attention. The mind feels unified, gathered into single-pointed focus. Many people describe joy or energy moving through the body, sometimes so intense it's almost overwhelming. Second jhana involves settling. The initial rapture quiets into deeper pleasure and concentrated calm. The need for effort decreases. Attention remains stable with less active maintenance. Consciousness feels collected, smooth, continuous. Third jhana brings a shift from pleasure to profound equanimity. The blissful sensations fade, replaced by calm clarity and balanced awareness. Some practitioners find this stage subtler and easier to maintain than earlier, more intense states. Fourth jhana reaches deep equanimity and purity of mindfulness. Neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just clear, stable presence. The sense of breathing, of being a body, can become very subtle. What remains is balanced, unified awareness. Beyond these formed jhanas lie formless states, consciousness absorbed in concepts like infinite space, or infinite consciousness rather than physical sensations. These become progressively more subtle and refined. Neuroscientists studying jhana practitioners find distinct brain patterns for each stage. Concentration correlates with increased theta and alpha waves. Deeper states show reduced default mode network activity and altered connectivity between regions. What's remarkable is the reproducibility. Different people practicing similar techniques report recognizably similar experiences. The phenomenology matches across individuals and traditions, suggesting jhanas represent genuine neurological states rather than culturally shaped beliefs. But concentration alone doesn't lead to cessation. The jhanas create stability and reveal consciousness's range, but they still involve experience, something it's like to be in absorption. For consciousness to stop entirely, something more is needed. This is where insight becomes crucial. Concentration provides the stable platform, but insight provides the investigation that can deconstruct even the subtlest experiences. Still, the concentration foundation proves essential. Without ability to sustain focus, deeper investigation becomes impossible. The mind needs stability before it can examine its own functioning clearly enough to let go completely. Developing this stability requires patience. Progress often feels slow. Days of practice might show no obvious improvement, but microscopic changes accumulate, attention becoming fractionally steadier, the space between wandering and noticing it shrinking, the capacity to rest in focus gradually strengthening, and then, sometimes unexpectedly, a threshold is crossed. Concentration suddenly deepens into absorption. What was difficult becomes effortless. The mind finds its groove and settles into steadiness previously inaccessible. These moments encourage continued practice. They demonstrate concretely that consciousness has capabilities beyond ordinary awareness, that training actually works, that deeper territories exist and can be reached. Watching closely, you notice something strange. Experience isn't continuous. It arises in discrete moments, sensations appearing and disappearing, thoughts emerging and dissolving, even the sense of self flickering rather than holding steady. This observation forms the core of insight meditation. Instead of concentrating on a single object, attention observes the process of experiencing itself, noting how everything that arises also passes. Start with physical sensations. That pressure where you're sitting, is it constant? Look closely and it shimmers, fluctuates, comes and goes in waves. The apparent solidity of body sense dissolves into cascading impermanent events. Thoughts show the same pattern. They arise from nowhere, persist briefly, then vanish. You don't create thoughts intentionally. They appear in consciousness already formed, and you don't choose when they dissolve. They simply cease when their moment ends. Even the sense of being someone observing is constructed moment by moment. The feeling of I isn't continuous. It's rebuilt constantly through subtle processes of identification and self-reference. This investigation, called vipassana or insight practice, systematically deconstructs the apparent solidity of experience. What seemed stable reveals itself as process. What felt like self shows its conditioned, constructed nature. Different schools approach this investigation differently. Mahasi style noting labels each experience as it arises: thinking, hearing, pressure, seeing. The labeling creates slight distance from experience, preventing the mind from getting lost in content while maintaining clear observation. Another approach involves scanning attention through the body, observing sensations in sequence. This reveals how much is happening beneath ordinary awareness, countless sensations constantly arising, shifting, dissolving across every inch of body space. Some traditions emphasize observing the gaps between experiences. Between thoughts, brief spaces appear. Between sensations, moments of quiet. Training attention to notice these gaps reveals consciousness's background spaciousness. As insight practice deepens, certain landmarks typically appear. Practitioners describe moving through stages where perception changes dramatically. Experience might speed up, sensations arising and passing so rapidly they blur into vibration, or it might fragment into discrete moments with gaps clearly visible between them. There's often a phase where suffering becomes more apparent. You see clearly how attachment to pleasant experiences creates tension, how resistance to unpleasant ones generates aversion, how ignorance about experiences' nature perpetuates confusion. This can be difficult but represents important progress, seeing the mechanism that creates dissatisfaction. Eventually, if practice continues, something shifts. The sense of observing from a separate location dissolves. There's no longer you watching experiences happen over there, just experience arising and passing without center. This is where insight becomes radical. The intuitive sense of being a continuous self residing behind your eyes, thinking thoughts and having experiences, that structure starts coming apart. What remains is process without owner, experience happening without experiencer in the usual sense. Neuroscience offers some explanation. The default mode network, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex, constructs the narrative self, the story of who you are across time. Insight meditation appears to quiet this network, reducing self-referential processing. Without constant self-construction, experience changes qualitatively. Things still happen, sensations arise, thoughts appear, but there's less sense of them happening to a particular someone. The possessive relationship with experience loosens. This loosening creates conditions where cessation becomes possible. As long as consciousness maintains the self-project, the ongoing construction and defense of identity, it continues running. But insight reveals that project is optional, constructed, something the mind is doing, rather than what you fundamentally are. Seeing this clearly and deeply, the mind can release even the subtlest self-maintenance processes. And when that release becomes complete, when even the most refined sense of observer dissolves, consciousness can stop entirely. The integration of concentration and insight proves crucial. Concentration provides stability for investigation. Insight prevents concentration from becoming mere absorption. Together, they create conditions where consciousness can examine its own construction deeply enough to release it. Teachers often describe the path as having two wings. Concentration alone can reach remarkable states but might not fundamentally transform understanding. Insight alone can reveal truth but might lack the stability to sustain deep realization. Together they carry practice toward territories including cessation. Here's the paradox. You can't make cessation happen. Every attempt to create it, to control it, to force consciousness to stop, that very effort keeps it running. Cessation requires letting go so completely that even the intention to let go releases. It's not a state you enter, but a threshold you cross by ceasing to maintain what keeps you from it. Think about trying to fall asleep. The more you try, the more awake you stay. Sleep comes when you stop trying, when you surrender to whatever happens. Cessation works similarly but requires even deeper release. The progression toward it involves identifying and releasing layers of control. First, you let go of actively thinking, allowing thoughts to arise and pass without engaging them. Then you let go of controlling attention, permitting awareness to rest naturally rather than forcing focus. Deeper still, you release effort itself, the subtle doing that maintains concentration. Even deep jhana involves some minimal effort, some trace of intention to stay in the state. That too must dissolve. Then comes releasing the sense of observer, the feeling of being someone watching experience. This identity as witness, as the one who's aware, represents subtle self-construction. It too is conditioned, optional, something consciousness is doing rather than what you fundamentally are. Finally, there's releasing the releasing, letting go of the one who lets go. As long as there's a you managing the process, consciousness continues. The final release is recognizing that even the releaser as constructed can dissolve. This might sound mystical, but practitioners describe it as recognizably distinct from confusion or random mental wandering. There's clarity in the progression, a sense of systematically undoing layers of maintenance until nothing remains to maintain. Some traditions use analogies. It's like watching a spinning top gradually slow. Eventually it reaches a point where the slightest change tips it from spinning to stillness, or like a wave that's been traveling far across the ocean, finally reaching shore and dissolving into calm water. The moment itself can't be controlled, but conditions can be established. Having deep concentration creates stability. Having insight into constructed nature creates understanding. Being in supportive environment, on retreat, away from demands, reduces obstacles. Then there's a quality of allowing, of non-interference, not trying to make something happen or prevent something, not looking for special experiences, just clear, open awareness allowing whatever arises without grasping or rejecting. Teachers emphasize that cessation finds you rather than you finding it. When conditions align, concentration deep enough, insight clear enough, releasing complete enough, it simply happens. Consciousness stops not because you made it stop, but because there's nothing left maintaining it. Some practitioners describe a characteristic sensation immediately before, often fear or resistance arising as consciousness approaches cessation. Something in the system recognizes that awareness is about to stop, and survival instincts activate, trying to prevent it. Working through this fear is often necessary. You must become comfortable with consciousness ceasing. Trust that it will return. Recognize that the gap won't harm you. Each approach that gets blocked by fear teaches the system that cessation is safe, gradually reducing resistance. Eventually, maybe after many attempts, the release becomes complete. The final trace of self-maintenance dissolves, and consciousness, having nothing left to sustain it, stops. The fascinating thing is that this can't be remembered from inside. There's no moment of, oh, I'm about to stop existing now, because by the time that would be recognized, you've already stopped. The transition is unobservable because there's no observer at the critical instant. What can be known is before, clear awareness, deep stillness, everything releasing, and after, consciousness returning, recognizing the gap, feeling the absence where continuity should be. Practitioners sometimes try for years to reach cessation, approaching the threshold repeatedly without crossing it. Then, often when they've stopped trying so hard, stopped looking for it specifically, it happens. The not trying itself becomes the final release necessary. This suggests that control and cessation are fundamentally incompatible. As long as any part of you is steering the process, consciousness continues. Only when all steering stops, All doing ceases, all maintenance releases, only then can awareness itself switch off. Experiencing cessation doesn't automatically solve life's problems. You don't emerge enlightened, free from all difficulty, permanently at peace. What you emerge with is an experience that must be integrated, understood, and related to ongoing existence. Some practitioners report immediate, dramatic shifts. Anxiety about death decreases significantly, having experienced consciousness fully stopping. The fear of its permanent cessation loses some power. There's direct knowledge that stopping doesn't hurt, doesn't feel like anything, isn't suffering. Others notice reduced identification with thoughts and emotions. If consciousness can completely cease and return, the thoughts and feelings that normally seem so defining appear more clearly as transient events. This creates distance, making it easier to let difficult experiences pass without getting consumed by them. But integration isn't automatic or uniform. Some people experience cessation and feel confused about what it means. Was it real? Did it matter? What should change now? The absence of content during cessation gives little to grasp, making it hard to know what to make of the experience. There's also risk of spiritual bypassing, using cessation as evidence of advancement while ignoring ongoing psychological issues. Someone might achieve this rare meditative attainment yet still struggle with relationship patterns, emotional reactivity, or unhealthy behaviors. Traditional Buddhist frameworks interpret cessation as confirmation of specific doctrines, proof of no self, of impermanence, of the possibility of liberation. If you experienced it within that context, these interpretations might feel natural and helpful. But if you approached it secularly or from a different tradition, integration requires finding your own meaning. What does it tell you about consciousness, about existence, about yourself? These aren't questions with predetermined answers. Some teachers warn against making too much of cessation. It's one experience, albeit unusual, but not necessarily more important than kindness, ethical living, or psychological health. Chasing rare states while neglecting ordinary virtue can create spiritual materialism, collecting experiences like trophies without actual transformation. The opposite danger is dismissing it entirely. Cessation reveals something genuinely significant about consciousness's nature. Ignoring that knowledge, trying to return to assumptions that awareness is continuous and solid, means missing an opportunity for deeper understanding. Healthy integration probably involves middle ground, recognizing cessation as meaningful without making it define your identity. It happened, it showed you something, now what? How does that knowledge inform how you live? For some, the answer involves continued practice. Cessation becomes less important than the overall path of understanding and liberation. The experience confirms that path's validity, providing motivation to continue investigating consciousness even more deeply. Others find their relationship to meditation changes. Having reached what many traditions describe as a significant milestone, the urgent striving can ease. Practice becomes less about achieving special states and more about simple presence, clear awareness, responsive living. There can be challenges communicating about cessation. Most people have no reference for consciousness completely stopping. Explaining it often meets skepticism, confusion, or New Age platitudes that miss the experience's specificity. This can create isolation, having touched something profound but unable to share it meaningfully. Some practitioners find community with others who've experienced similar states. Sharing experiences, comparing notes, and discussing integration together provides support that solo practice doesn't. Others prefer keeping it private, treating it as personal knowledge that doesn't need external validation. The experience itself was real. Whether others believe it or understand it matters less than what you do with the understanding it provided. Integration also involves ordinary concerns. Did your relationship to work change? How do you handle stress differently? Are you kinder, more patient, less reactive? The real test isn't the dramatic moment of cessation, but how the insight it provided, consciousness as conditional, self as constructed, awareness as process, manifests in daily life. Some people find that life becomes simpler after cessation. The constant urgency, the feeling that you must figure everything out, solve every problem, optimize every moment, That pressure eases when you've directly experienced that you can completely stop existing and it's fine. Others discover new questions. If consciousness is that conditional, what else about experience is less solid than it seems? The investigation that led to cessation might extend into other territories, revealing more layers of construction in what felt fundamentally real. Within Buddhist frameworks, cessation means something specific, proof that liberation is possible, that the chains of suffering can be broken, that awakening isn't metaphor. The tradition views cessation as evidence for core teachings, consciousness constructed moment by moment rather than continuously existing. Cessation demonstrates this directly. The self as process without inherent nature. Cessation shows the self system can stop entirely, suffering rooted in attachment and ignorance. Cessation reveals that release is possible. Theravada Buddhism specifically treats Nirodha Samapatti, cessation attainment, as marking high levels of realization. Someone who reaches it has typically achieved anagami, non-returner status, or even arahant, full awakening. The experience proves they've penetrated deep truths about reality's nature. Why this interpretation? Because cessation appears to fulfill what the Buddha taught was possible: complete release from the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Everything is impermanent, constantly changing. Cessation exemplifies this radically. Consciousness itself impermanent, able to stop entirely. What could be more vivid proof that nothing lasts, nothing holds steady? Suffering arises from clinging to impermanent things as if they were stable. Cessation shows even consciousness, the thing you most identify with, can be released. If awareness itself isn't worth clinging to because it stops and returns fine, what else needs to be grasped? Non-self, perhaps the subtlest teaching, claims there's no permanent, unchanging self. Cessation offers direct evidence. The sense of being a continuous person vanishes completely in the gap. What returns afterward is recognizably you, but the discontinuity reveals that continuity is constructed rather than inherent. From this perspective, cessation isn't just an interesting experience. It's transformative proof of possibility, confirmation that the path works, that liberation isn't philosophical abstraction but achievable reality. Buddhist texts describe specific benefits from cessation. Practitioners who attain it supposedly overcome certain fetters binding them to suffering. Specifically, they're said to have removed doubt about the path, released attachment to rites and rituals, and greatly weakened sensory desire and ill will. More practically, cessation demonstrates that consciousness's demands can be completely released. The constant maintenance of self, the endless mental activity, the burden of being someone, all of it stops, and it's okay. This knowledge, once gained, changes relationship to ordinary consciousness's usual patterns. The tradition also sees cessation as marking irreversibility. Someone who's experienced it has directly verified the teachings in a way that can't be undone. Doubt may have existed before. Maybe these Buddhist claims are just philosophy. Maybe liberation is metaphor. But cessation provides empirical evidence within your own experience. You can't unknow what you directly discovered. This raises questions about whether cessation means the same thing outside Buddhist contexts. If someone reaches it through secular practice, without accepting Buddhist doctrine, does it still carry the same significance? Some argue yes. The experience reveals truths about consciousness regardless of framework. Awareness being conditional, self being constructed, release being possible. These facts exist independent of religious interpretation. Others suggest the meaning you make determines what you gain. Cessation provides direct experience of consciousness stopping. What that experience signifies: proof of enlightenment, neuroscience curiosity, random meditative anomaly, depends on the framework you apply. The Buddhist interpretation has coherence. It integrates cessation into a comprehensive path with clear objectives. The experience makes sense within that structure, pointing towards specific realizations and guiding further practice. But it's not the only interpretation available. Modern practitioners might frame cessation differently, as peak human performance, extreme meditation skill, or interesting consciousness capacity, without reference to liberation or awakening. What remains consistent across interpretations is cessation's demonstration of consciousness's conditional nature. However you frame it, you've discovered awareness isn't as solid as assumed. That discovery, regardless of religious context, carries significant implications. From a neuroscience perspective, cessation represents something equally fascinating but differently framed: extreme neuroplasticity, the brain learning to quiet self-referential processing completely, the default mode network, active when the mind isn't focused on external tasks, handles self-referential thinking: who you are, what others think of you, what might happen, what did happen. This network consumes significant energy and produces much of ordinary mental chatter. Meditation research shows that practice reduces DMN activity. Long-term meditators show decreased baseline activation in these regions compared to non-meditators. The brain literally reorganizes, requiring less self-referential processing even during rest. Cessation might represent the endpoint of this trajectory, the DMN learning to shut down completely, if temporarily. Not through damage or suppression, but through training, the brain develops capacity to stop the self-maintenance processes that normally run constantly. This framing emphasizes skill rather than mysticism. Like athletes training their bodies to perform extraordinary feats, meditators train their brains to access unusual states. Cessation becomes peak mental performance rather than spiritual achievement. Neural plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize based on experience, makes this plausible. London taxi drivers develop enlarged hippocampi from navigating the city. Musicians show enhanced auditory cortex development. Meditators might develop enhanced capacity for self-regulation and attention control. The concentration training strengthens attention networks. The insight practice reorganizes how the brain processes self-referential information. Together, these create conditions where default mode activity can decrease dramatically, potentially ceasing entirely. From outside, cessation looks like brief periods of profoundly quiet brain states. Self-reference stops. The usual mental chatter silences. Key networks maintaining the sense of continuous personal identity go offline. This isn't damage, it's control. The brain hasn't broken, it's learned a new configuration, and it's temporary, reversible, entered and exited with remarkable precision once mastered. The blissful aftermath might result from neurochemical changes. Meditation affects serotonin, dopamine, and endorphin systems. Cessation, representing extreme meditative depth, might trigger significant neurotransmitter release, producing the reported clarity and peace. Alternatively, the relief might come from the DMN restarting with temporarily reduced habitual patterns. Like rebooting a computer, cessation might allow default mode activity to resume, but fresher, less entrenched in usual grooves. This translation into neuroscience language has benefits. It makes cessation accessible to secular audiences, removes supernatural implications, and suggests it might be studied rigorously using standard scientific methods. But it also has limitations. Reducing cessation to brain states might miss something about the subjective significance. The felt sense of consciousness stopping, the philosophical implications for identity and awareness, these don't fully translate into neural activity descriptions. Moreover, neuroscience still can't explain consciousness itself. We know correlations, these brain patterns accompany awareness, but not how or why physical processes generate subjective experience. If we can't explain consciousness, explaining its cessation becomes even more mysterious. Still, the neuroscience framing offers practical value. It suggests cessation isn't supernatural or culturally constructed, but rather a genuine capacity of human neurology. Different traditions independently discovered methods to access it, because it's really there to be found. This view also predicts that as neuroscience advances, we'll develop better understanding of the mechanisms involved, better imaging technology, refined theories of consciousness, more sophisticated models of neural dynamics. All of these should gradually illuminate what happens during cessation. Perhaps we'll discover specific neural circuits that can be quieted through training. Maybe we'll find neurotransmitter patterns that correlate with approach and emergence. Possibly we'll develop interventions, neurofeedback, targeted stimulation that could facilitate reaching cessation more quickly, or maybe the mystery will persist. Consciousness might not reduce neatly to mechanisms we can measure and manipulate. Cessation might always retain something ineffable, directly knowable only through experience. What the neuroscience translation definitely provides is another vocabulary for discussing cessation, one based in biology rather than religion, in observation rather than doctrine. Whether that vocabulary captures everything important about cessation remains an open question. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have proposed various theories about how consciousness works. Cessation offers a test case, potentially supporting some theories while challenging others. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, suggests consciousness corresponds to integrated information in a system. The more information integrated across different parts, the more conscious the system. By this account, consciousness exists on a spectrum based on integration levels. Cessation might represent integrated information temporarily dropping to zero. The brain continues functioning, brain stem maintains breathing, regulatory systems persist, but the networks that integrate information into unified conscious experience stop their integrative activity. This fits phenomenology reasonably well. Cessation isn't gradual diminishment but collapse, from integrated experience to no experience. IIT would predict this if integration suddenly ceased rather than slowly declining. Global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars, treats consciousness as information broadcast globally across the brain. Unconscious processes operate locally, but when information enters the global workspace, it becomes conscious and available to multiple cognitive systems. Under this framework, cessation might involve the global workspace shutting down. Information processing continues locally, perception, memory, bodily regulation, but nothing broadcasts globally, so no unified conscious experience arises. This also seems consistent. Meditators don't report local processing stopping. Breathing continues, the body maintains itself, but the integrated awareness of all that stops. Higher-order thought theories suggest consciousness requires thoughts about thoughts, metacognition. You're conscious when you're aware of being aware, thinking about your thoughts. Cessation challenges this view somewhat. If consciousness requires metacognition, how can practitioners return from cessation remembering it happened? If there's truly no metacognition during the gap, how do they know it occurred? One response: memory forms immediately after, retrospectively recognizing the discontinuity. But this seems to require consciousness during cessation, even if minimal, enough to recognize upon return that a gap occurred. Another response: higher-order theories might need revision. Maybe consciousness doesn't always require metacognition. Cessation could be a state where primary consciousness ceases while minimal monitoring continues, creating memory of discontinuity without full awareness during it. Predictive processing theories view the brain as constantly generating predictions about incoming information and updating based on prediction errors. Consciousness might be the brain's best current prediction about the state of the world and self. Cessation might represent prediction temporarily stopping. The brain ceases generating its model of self and world. With no prediction running, there's no consciousness. When prediction resumes, consciousness returns. This has interesting implications. It suggests consciousness is fundamentally about modeling, constructing reality rather than passively receiving it. Cessation demonstrates that the modeling can stop completely, revealing it as process rather than given. Recurrent processing theories emphasize feedback loops between brain regions. Consciousness requires information processing through multiple iterations, with later stages feeding back to earlier ones. Cessation might involve these recurrent loops stopping. Forward processing continues. Stimuli still arrive at sensory regions, but without feedback, without iteration, conscious experience doesn't arise. What's notable is that cessation seems to fit multiple theories reasonably well, which might indicate they're describing different aspects of the same phenomenon. Consciousness likely involves integration, global broadcasting, prediction, recurrent processing, and more. Cessation would then represent all these processes ceasing simultaneously. The integrated information drops to zero, Global broadcast stops, prediction halts, recurrent loops break, metacognition ceases, and consciousness, depending on all of these, stops too. Alternatively, cessation might point toward whichever theory is closest to truth. If one theory predicts cessation's characteristics better than others, that's evidence for its accuracy. But consciousness theories remain deeply contested. Different researchers emphasize different aspects, and no consensus exists about which approach is correct. Cessation provides data, but interpreting that data requires prior commitments about consciousness's nature. What cessation does demonstrate clearly is that consciousness is conditional, dependent on certain processes continuing. It's not a fundamental property that can't change or stop. It's something the brain does that can start, stop, and restart. This conditionality challenges views treating consciousness as metaphysically primary or a simple property of matter. It suggests consciousness is complex, constructed, maintained by specific mechanisms that can be present or absent. Whether that makes consciousness more or less mysterious remains debatable. On one hand, showing it can stop and restart suggests it's mechanistic, understandable. On the other hand, we still can't explain how mechanisms produce subjective experience at all. Beyond philosophical and scientific interpretations, cessation carries personal significance for individuals who experience it. What does it mean for how you live, for how you understand yourself and existence? Many practitioners report shifts in death anxiety. Mortality feels less threatening when you've experienced consciousness completely stopping. It wasn't frightening or painful, just gap, then return. If dying resembles cessation, there's no suffering in it, no experience of being dead to endure. This doesn't mean death loses all emotional weight. You might still grieve the loss of future experiences, relationships, unfinished projects, but the existential terror, fear of non-existence itself, often diminishes. Some describe feeling more present in daily life. If consciousness can stop at any moment, and that's fine, urgency about constantly planning, controlling, and optimizing decreases as more trust in simply being here, responding to what arises. Relationship to thoughts changes for many. Thoughts previously seemed like you, your opinions, your identity. Post-cessation, they appear more clearly as events consciousness produces, not definitive of who you are, but just mental activity arising and passing. This creates distance that can be liberating. Difficult thought, anxiety, self-criticism, rumination lose some power when you see them as transient phenomena rather than truth. They're just mind doing what minds do, not necessarily reflecting reality accurately. Others report reduced need for constant stimulation. Ordinary consciousness often feels uncomfortable, leading to seeking distraction through phones, entertainment, food, or activity. Experiencing consciousness stop reveals that discomfort is optional. Awareness itself doesn't inherently hurt. This can support contentment with simplicity. You don't need to constantly fill experience with stimulation because the base state, properly understood, isn't suffering that requires escape. Some people find their priorities shift, chasing achievements, accumulating experiences, building impressive identities. These projects can feel less urgent when you've directly seen consciousness as conditional and self as constructed. What seems important might become more basic: relationships, kindness, presence, understanding. If the elaborate self you maintain can switch off completely, maintaining it elaborately feels less necessary. But integration isn't always comfortable. Some practitioners struggle with feeling different from others who haven't shared the experience. You've touched something that radically shifted understanding, but most people have no reference for it. This can create loneliness or sense of disconnect. How do you explain that consciousness can stop? How do you convey what that reveals about self and existence? Often you can't, leading to keeping the experience private. Others face challenges when cessation doesn't resolve expected problems. Maybe you hoped it would eliminate anxiety, end depression, fix relationship difficulties. Discovering it doesn't automatically heal everything can be disillusioning. Cessation reveals truths about consciousness's nature but doesn't bypass psychological development, emotional healing, or practical life skills. Those require different work. For some, The experience becomes touchstone they return to when confused or suffering. Remembering that consciousness stopped and it was fine, that self is constructed, that nothing is as solid as it feels. This memory provides perspective during difficulty. Others find cessation less central to ongoing life. It happened, it was significant, but daily existence continues requiring attention to ordinary concerns. The experience informs understanding but doesn't dominate identity. Perhaps the deepest personal meaning is experiential confirmation that consciousness isn't what it seems. We assume awareness is continuous, stable, fundamentally who we are. Cessation reveals it as conditional, constructed, process rather than entity. What you do with that knowledge is individual. Some use it to deepen meditation practice. Some apply it to reducing suffering. Some simply carry it quietly, a secret understanding that occasionally surfaces to provide perspective. The meaning isn't given, it's made. Cessation provides experience, but you determine its significance through how you integrate it into your life, what changes you allow it to inspire, what relationship you maintain with the mystery it reveals. As meditation moves mainstream, with apps offering guided practice and corporations providing mindfulness training, questions arise about teaching advanced practices widely. Should cessation be presented as accessible goal for ordinary meditators, or should it remain in the territory of dedicated practitioners, those willing to invest thousands of hours on intensive retreats? Arguments for democratization emphasize potential benefits. If cessation reduces anxiety, loosens identification with difficult thoughts, and provides experiential insight into consciousness's nature, making it accessible could help many people. Modern teaching methods, scientific understanding, and supportive technologies might make reaching cessation more efficient than traditional approaches. What took monks years might be accessible to sincere practitioners in shorter time frames. There's also precedent. Advanced practices once taught only to monastics have been successfully adapted for laypeople. Vipassana meditation, originally requiring renunciation and intensive study, now reaches millions through secular 10-day courses. Why not extend this to cessation? Teaching methods could be refined, making the path clearer. Communities could support practitioners navigating challenging stages. Secular frameworks could make it accessible beyond Buddhist contexts. Arguments for restriction emphasize potential risks. Deep meditation can destabilize identity, trigger difficult psychological material, or create confusion if not properly supported. Cessation, being especially radical, might produce more challenge than benefit for some people. Without traditional monastic structure, teachers, community, ethical framework, practitioners might reach cessation unprepared for integration. The experience could become spiritual trophy rather than genuine insight, feeding ego rather than releasing it. There's also question of whether teaching cessation as goal distorts practice. Traditional paths emphasized gradual cultivation of wisdom, concentration, and virtue. Cessation emerged naturally from that foundation rather than being pursued directly. Modern goal-oriented approaches might create striving that actually prevents cessation. If you're trying hard to reach it, measuring progress, feeling frustrated when it doesn't happen, that very effort maintains the self-system preventing release. Some teachers suggest middle path. Teach the practices that can lead to cessation without making cessation itself the focus. Develop concentration, cultivate insight, understand impermanence and non-self. If cessation happens, it happens. If not, the practice still provides benefit. This avoids both pitfalls, not keeping profound practices secret, but also not turning them into achievement targets that distort motivation. Another consideration is individual differences. Some people seem neurologically or temperamentally suited for extreme meditation states. Others benefit more from gentler approaches focusing on ordinary well-being. Democratizing cessation might mean presenting it as one option among many, rather than pinnacle everyone should pursue. For certain practitioners, it's appropriate goal. For others, different practices serve better. The integration challenges also matter. If thousands of people experience cessation through accessible programs, do support structures exist for helping them make sense of it? Or would many end up confused, unsupported, possibly harmed by destabilization without adequate guidance. Traditional systems prepared practitioners gradually, ensuring readiness before advanced practices. Modern democratization might skip preparation, producing experiences people can't integrate. Yet there's also argument that making knowledge widely available allows individuals to determine their own readiness. Gatekeeping, even well-intentioned, can perpetuate power imbalances and limit access based on institutional membership rather than genuine readiness. Perhaps the resolution involves transparency paired with careful teaching. Make information about cessation available but emphasize foundation practices, warn about challenges, recommend qualified teachers for those seriously pursuing it. This allows informed self-determination while providing caution and guidance. People can assess their own interest and readiness rather than having access controlled by authority. What seems clear is that cessation, like other advanced meditation territory, requires respect. It's not parlor trick or performance skill, but profound capacity with real effects on consciousness and identity. Whether teaching it widely proves beneficial or harmful may depend less on democratization itself and more on how it's presented, with appropriate context, realistic expectations, and adequate support for integration. Despite research, testimony, and theory, fundamental questions about cessation remain unanswered. What exactly stops during cessation? We can say consciousness ceases, but consciousness itself remains mysterious. We don't know how neurons produce awareness in the first place, so how those processes stop becomes equally opaque. Is cessation complete absence of experience, or just absence of memory? Meditators report gap with no recollection, but does that prove nothing happened? Could minimal experience occur without forming retrievable memory? Current evidence suggests genuine absence, the consistency of reports, the phenomenology of discontinuity, the lack of any content. But absolute certainty requires either experiencing cessation yourself or solving consciousness's hard problem, and we've done neither yet. Where does consciousness go when it stops? This question might be malformed. Consciousness isn't something that goes places, but the intuition persists. If awareness was present, then absent, then present again, what happened to it? One answer: consciousness is process, not entity. Processes can stop and restart without going anywhere. Like a flame extinguished and relit, consciousness simply ceases as process then resumes. But this doesn't fully satisfy. The subjective continuity, the sense that the consciousness returning is the same awareness that stopped, feels like it needs explanation. What maintains identity across the gap? What initiates cessation and what ends it? We know some conditions: deep concentration, profound insight, complete release, but the actual mechanism triggering consciousness to stop remains unknown. Similarly, what brings it back? If there's no one present during cessation to decide to return, what restarts awareness? Is it automatic, like breathing resuming after brief pause? Is there threshold where neural activity naturally resumes generating consciousness? Does cessation exist on a spectrum, or is it binary? Either consciousness completely stops or it doesn't. Reports suggest binary discontinuity, but could there be degrees? Might some people reach near cessation while others achieve complete cessation? Current phenomenology treats it as all or nothing, but perhaps finer discrimination would reveal gradations. Maybe what seems like sudden switch is actually rapid cascade with intermediate stages too brief to notice. Can cessation be reached through paths other than meditation? Traditional practice routes involve concentration and insight, but could other methods work? Neurofeedback, targeted brain stimulation, psychedelics combined with specific mental training? These questions aren't merely academic. They point to genuine unknowns where neither ancient wisdom nor modern science has definitive answers. Cessation remains edge case where our understanding reaches limits. Perhaps some questions will yield to investigation. Better neuroscience, more practitioners studied, refined theory. These might illuminate mechanisms and conditions, but others might persist. If consciousness itself remains mysterious despite decades of intensive study, its cessation will likely remain mysterious too. The boundary where awareness stops might be one limit our tools can't quite reach. What we're left with is uncertainty. Not frustrating absence of knowledge, but space for wonder. Something real happens when consciousness stops. Something consistent and reproducible, yet something that preserves mystery even as it reveals truth about awareness's conditional nature. Your consciousness has never stopped. Not once, from the moment it emerged in early childhood until this very moment, has awareness fully ceased. Even in your deepest sleep, some minimal experience continued. Dreams, vague sensations, the brain's ongoing processing. Even in moments you can't remember, consciousness persisted. Memory simply didn't record it. This continuity feels normal because it's all you've known. Consciousness seems like the default, the baseline, the steady ground everything else happens on. It doesn't feel like something being maintained, it just is. But consider how extraordinary that is. For decades, your brain has sustained awareness continuously, generating the feeling of being present, of existing as a point of experience in the universe. Never fully stopping, never completely powering down. The energy this requires is substantial. Your brain, 3 pounds of tissue, consumes 20% of your body's resources. Much of that goes toward maintaining consciousness, the ongoing sense of self, the continuous processing, the never-ending stream of awareness. And you do this effortlessly, automatically, without trying. Consciousness continues whether you want it to or not, whether you notice it or not. It's the one thing you can't not do while alive. Cessation reveals how remarkable this continuity is by demonstrating its conditional nature. The fact that consciousness can stop shows that its continuation isn't inevitable or metaphysically necessary. It's something your brain actively maintains. This flips perspective. Instead of consciousness being the default that sometimes changes into sleep or distraction, it's an ongoing achievement, a process continuously regenerated moment by moment. Most humans live entire lives without this process pausing even briefly. The stream flows from first awakening to final loss, decades of continuous awareness with no gaps, no breaks, no cessation. There's something both beautiful and exhausting about this. Beautiful because consciousness allows experiencing everything: joy, wonder, connection, understanding. Exhausting because it never fully rests. Even in sleep, processing continues. Cessation offers contrast that makes ordinary consciousness visible, like how you don't notice breathing until you hold your breath. You don't notice awareness's constant presence until you encounter its absence. For most people, this remains theoretical. You'll never experience cessation, never know consciousness stopping, but you can reflect on its possibility, recognizing that awareness isn't as inevitable as it feels. This recognition doesn't require meditation, just noticing that consciousness could be otherwise, that it's conditional, maintained, process rather than ground, shifts relationship with it. Perhaps you feel slightly less trapped in your thoughts, knowing they're not inevitable. Maybe anxiety about existence lessens, recognizing that consciousness isn't burden you can never put down. It's already putting itself down and picking itself up constantly. Or maybe nothing changes. You're aware now, were aware yesterday, will be aware tomorrow. The continuity persists regardless of understanding it differently, but there's something to be said for recognizing the ordinary extraordinariness of consciousness, this thing you do continuously without trying. This presence that feels so simple yet remains profoundly mysterious. Right now, awareness is here. Tomorrow it will still be here, unchanged in its basic presence even as content shifts completely. This reliability we rarely appreciate, this continuous stream we take for granted, deserves some wonder, not because it's proof of anything or means something metaphysically, just because it's remarkable that matter can organize itself into experience, that neurons can generate the feeling of being someone, that awareness happens at all. Cessation reminds us that this remarkableness is also fragile, conditional, not guaranteed. But for most of us, most of the time, it persists, ordinary in its constancy, extraordinary in its existence. You don't need to meditate for thousands of hours to think about what cessation reveals. You don't need to experience consciousness stopping to consider what its possibility suggests. Right now, awareness is present. You're here, reading or listening, thoughts arising, sensations occurring. This seems simple, obvious, barely worth noting. But is it simple? What is this awareness actually? Where does it come from? What maintains it? Why does it feel like being someone rather than just processes happening? These questions don't have complete answers. Neuroscience maps correlates brain activity that accompanies consciousness, but can't fully explain how matter becomes experience. Philosophy offers frameworks, but no consensus about awareness's fundamental nature. Cessation adds another question. If consciousness can stop completely and resume, what does that tell us about what it is? Maybe it suggests awareness is more fluid, less solid than ordinary experience indicates. We feel like continuous beings, but perhaps we're more like processes that can pause and restart, patterns that can dissolve and reform. This isn't threatening unless you believe solidity is necessary for meaning. Perhaps impermanence and conditionality don't diminish experience. They're just accurate description of how things actually work. You don't need to know exactly what consciousness is to live well. Uncertainty about awareness's nature doesn't prevent loving people, doing meaningful work, or experiencing beauty and joy. In fact, not knowing might be more honest than pretending certainty. Consciousness remains mysterious despite intensive investigation. Accepting that mystery instead of demanding complete explanation seems appropriate response. Cessation represents one mystery within the larger mystery. Some people, through particular training, can make consciousness temporarily stop. Why this is possible, what it means, what happens in the gap, these remain partially unknown. But partial knowledge is still knowledge. We know cessation occurs, know it's reproducible, know it correlates with specific practices and brain states. We know it affects people who experience it, often profoundly. What we make of that knowledge is individual. Some pursue the experience directly. Some find it interesting but tangential to their lives. Some use it to reflect on consciousness without needing to experience cessation themselves. All these responses are valid. There's no obligation to care about cessation, to pursue it, or to find it meaningful. It's one phenomenon among countless others, fascinating to some, irrelevant to others. But if you do find it intriguing, permission to wonder is freely available. You can think about what consciousness stopping would mean. You can consider whether the self feels as continuous as it claims. You can notice awareness itself, this thing you're doing right now, without quite knowing how. This wondering doesn't require special training or belief systems, just curiosity, attention, willingness to sit with questions that don't have neat answers. Maybe you notice that thoughts arise without your choosing them. Maybe you observe how awareness shifts quality throughout the day. Maybe you wonder what exactly is watching when you watch your thoughts. These simple observations can reveal complexity in what seems straightforward. Consciousness, examined even casually, shows features that don't quite make sense, that feel paradoxical, mysterious, worthy of continued investigation. Cessation takes that mystery to an extreme, but the mystery exists here already, in ordinary awareness happening right now. You're conscious and don't fully know why or how. That's worth wondering about, whether or not consciousness ever stops. The permission isn't something granted externally. It's recognizing that curiosity about awareness is natural, that questions without complete answers are acceptable, that uncertainty is okay. You're aware now. That's extraordinary, really. That it could stop and resume makes it even stranger. That you can think about this, wondering about consciousness using consciousness itself, that's strange too. None of this needs resolution. Wonder can exist without demanding answers. Questions can be held lightly, returned to occasionally, left open. Cessation offers one angle for approaching these mysteries, but the mysteries are here already, available for considering whenever you're interested, requiring nothing more than noticing what's already happening. This awareness, this presence, this ordinary remarkable fact of being conscious at all. Here at the end we return to where we began. Consciousness, flowing continuously for most of us, occasionally stopping for a few. Whether it stops or not, whether cessation happens or remains theoretical, awareness continues its basic function, being here, allowing experience, generating the sense of presence that defines existence. You've been conscious throughout this exploration. Thoughts arose as you listened, attention shifted, perhaps curiosity emerged or boredom, perhaps wonder or skepticism. All of that happened within awareness, this space that's so familiar you rarely notice it. Cessation reveals consciousness as conditional, but conditionality doesn't make something less real. The fact that awareness depends on causes, that it can stop and start, doesn't diminish its immediate presence. Right now, you're aware. This isn't achievement or something you're doing well or poorly. It's just what's happening. Consciousness is here, operating as it does, generating this moment's experience, the mystery of why this happens, how matter becomes awareness, what consciousness fundamentally is. Those questions remain. And that's all right. Not everything needs explanation for you to exist within it. Some people will pursue cessation, spending years training their minds to reach that threshold where awareness stops. Others will never think about it again after this moment. Both paths are fine. What matters isn't whether you experience cessation or understand consciousness completely. What matters is how you meet this present awareness, with kindness toward yourself and others, with curiosity about experience, with acceptance of what you don't know. If cessation teaches anything beyond its specific phenomenology, it's that consciousness is more flexible, more conditional, less solid than it feels. This knowledge can loosen the grip of thoughts that claim absolute truth, reduce identification with passing mental states, create space around difficulty, but you don't need cessation to access that flexibility. Every moment offers opportunity to notice awareness's fluidity, to recognize thoughts as events rather than truth, to find space within experience as you prepare for sleep or continue into your evening or move toward whatever comes next. Consciousness will continue its work. It will generate sensations, produce thoughts, create the ongoing feeling of being present. Sometimes this feels burdensome, the constant mental activity, the endless thoughts, the inability to truly rest from being aware. Sometimes it feels miraculous, the capacity to experience anything at all, the richness of sensation and thought, the inexplicable fact of existence. Both are true. Consciousness is burden and gift, ordinary and extraordinary, simple and profoundly mysterious, whether it can stop or not, whether cessation reveals deep truths or represents interesting edge case. Awareness persists for now. This breath, this thought, this moment, all arising within consciousness that asks nothing from you except to be here as it naturally is. So perhaps that's enough. Not needing to achieve special states, not requiring complete understanding, not demanding experience be other than it is. Just this awareness, mysteriously present, conditionally continuing, allowing everything, including the wondering about itself. Rest in that if you can. Let consciousness do what it does, arising, persisting, eventually quieting into sleep's gentler mode. No effort needed, no special accomplishment required. You're aware now. That's already everything. And if sometimes awareness stops, revealing its conditional nature, that's interesting too. But it doesn't change this moment's simple fact. Consciousness here, experience happening, the gift of presence requiring nothing more than allowing it to be exactly as it is.